Buenos días a todos y a todas. Bueno, antes de empezar con la conferencia de Aileen, simplemente un par de palabras acerca del servicio de interpretación que vamos a tener a lo largo de estos 3 días. Como ven a la entrada les hemos dado unos receptores, les hemos pedido a cambio sus DNI para que cuando nos los devuelvan pues se los podamos entregar. Y les pedimos por favor que si van a ir a tomar un café o bien se queden el receptor con ustedes y se lo lleven o bien lo dejen en el asiento pero perfectamente localizado. Para la gente que nos sigue por Zoom, también tenemos servicio de interpretación. Simplemente tienen que hacer clic en el pequeño globo terráqueo que verán en la parte baja de la pantalla y que dice interpretación. Y ahí podrán seleccionar el idioma inglés o español en el que desean escuchar la conferencia. Bueno, eso era todo respecto a la interpretación. Vamos a pasar a la conferencia que Aileen nos ha hecho llegar. First, I would like to apologize for being unable to present this lecture, but my dear friend Amalia asked me to write it nonetheless and send it to her. I admit that this paper is a rather self-indulgent love letter to the 18th century, which seems to me to possess, in its stress, the potential to create a world of delight, fantasy, playfulness, and magic. This can involve disguise and deceit, a highly developed sense of the theatrical and of role-playing, and the sense of the transitory. It is a rather strange and ephemeral lecture, akin to the subject itself, an excuse perhaps to include some of my favorite paintings. For artists are essential in the creation of this theme in the 18th century culture, which encompasses both reality and fantasy. This is probably the artist's wife, the French pastelist Marie-Suzanne Girouste, flirtatiously posing, her face half hidden by the black silk mantle which covers most of the pink dress and reveals a glimpse of her breast, drawn to our attention by the placing of the short silk open mitten on her right hand. She holds a fine French gilded ivory fan up to her lips, as though to ask us what role, if any, she might be playing here. Traditionally described as wearing the black veil worn by women in Bologna, it seems more likely to me that she is playing games in the artist's studio, black silk draped over her head. Look at me. Who or what am I? Daniel Roche has famously called fashion in the second half of the 18th century the culture of appearances, due to the greater visibility of women in society and the new availability of fashion magazines. The poet Stéphane Mallarmé, in the 1870s, he was also the editor of a Paris fashion journal called La Dernière Mode, declared, "La mode est la déesse des apparences." Fantasy and imagination were manifest in fashion illustration from the 1770s. Here is the frontispiece to the first volume of the Galerie des Modes et Costumes Français from 1778, an image of almost overpowering femininity in which cupids have fun with fashion, frilly dresses, cloaks, accessories, ribbons, and feathers, all very rococo, and thus to be deplored by critics such as Melcher Grimm, who disliked, quote, toutes sortes de fanfreluches, all kinds of sillinesses, frivolities, with specific reference to the work of Boucher. Although fashion was an accepted topic for discussion in the Salons and made an increasingly important contribution to the French economy, it still has today, perhaps, many critics who complained of its craze for novelty, extravagance, and occasional silliness. This French fan pokes gentle fun at female caprice and vanity, apropos the towering hairstyles of the period. The hairdresser needs a ladder to put the finishing touch to his creation, and the young man on the left a spyglass to see the top of it. If one had to conjure up an image which epitomizes the height of elite luxury in the 18th century, might I suggest the young couple from the Galerie des Modes et Costumes Français of 1779 in court dress of the most refined and luxurious kind. The young woman collecting alms wears a richly decorated robe de cour with hoop and train. He is in a silk habit habillé embroidered with colored spangles, paillettes, powder wig, and sword, which was the emblem of the old feudal nobility. Both figures have the polished manners of the court and the elegant but not exaggerated deportment taught by the dancing master. They are performing one of the arcane ceremonies allowed to the privileged few at what one author calls the gilded ghetto of the French court, a world away from everyday existence, as reflected in their costumes. With virtue of hindsight, we know that this kind of existence had to end, but such images remained to some extent in the public imagination in later centuries, as evidence of a lost dreamlike society which could only be recalled mainly in art and theatre. Richard Strauss, for example, in Der Rosenkavalier of 1911, creates a sublime Viennese fantasy set in the mid-18th century, performed to the music of the modern waltz. Themes of love, loss, and regret in the opera take us back to Mozart's bittersweet Così fan tutti of 1790, in which love is seen as a game undermined by disguise and deceit, and only perhaps at the end redeemed by love. Strauss was inspired in his contrived Rococo world, which incorporates both high and low in society, by William Hogarth's Mariage à la mode of 1743-45. In scene 1 of the opera, the Marschallin holds her morning levée, a form of theatre inspired by Versailles, in which grandes dames prepare themselves like works of art for the final details of their toilettes and the pleasures and events of the day. She is attended by favored modistes and friends, and as her hair is being done, a tenor sings. Scene 4 from Hogarth's Mariage à la mode is a cynical version of the Levée, in which he deplores the vanity and pretentiousness of such customs, mainly derived from France, but also Italy. Strauss's Marschallin is a great lady, a sympathetic character, but the vain and spendthrift Countess Squanderfield, here having her hair dressed, is only interested in elite French manners and fashions. She wears a yellow silk robe à la française, and her coiffeur is French. When her hair has been finished, she will complete her makeup by placing black spots on her face from a patch box on her dressing table. The rather motley collection of guests listen to an Italian castrato singer, and Lady Squanderfield listens to the lawyer Silvertongue, who invites her to a masquerade from which inevitably there are terrible consequences. Although Hogarth was anti-French, he was above all an artist, and it seems to me that some sense of Rococo is perhaps deliberately evident in this scene. After all, in his analysis of beauty of 1753, he admires the beauty of contriving winding shapes. Although Hogarth loves to poke fun at fashion, he took it seriously, fascinated by its details and meanings. He plays games with its possibilities and what they reveal about people. The Rococo, so often thought of as merely the art of pleasure and hedonism, is more complex than that. As William Park notes in The Idea of Rococo, there is what he calls a double structure, Zweischnelligkeit, which involves playing with appearance, conflicting values and emotions, and a love of transformation. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Boucher's portrait of Madame de Pompadour. Perdón, hay un error con la presentación. Sí. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Boucher's portraits of Madame de Pompadour, in which her love of fancy dress and theatre is reflected in his images of her. The great French fashion historian Jules Michelet, suggested that Pompadour's success with Louis XV was due to the fact that she constantly reinvented herself through her appearance, stage managed by Boucher. We are all familiar with the lavish three-dimensional statement dresses, all flounces and luxurious trifles, which I think he designed for her as he did her theatre costumes. These are the portraits which Diderot hated, describing the artist as the mortal enemy of silence, that is, a lack of seriousness. Too much is going on, and in the battle between fashion and the femme savante, the former always wins. In this sketchy portrait of Pompadour standing by her harpsichord, we see a glittering dress of silvery gold tissue of uncertain construction. The rounded short sleeves over gauzy undersleeves perhaps suggest a slight reference to the dress of Van Dyck in the 1630s. I think that this dress was an invention by Boucher based on the lines of fashion. The laces at the front of the bodies are a theatrical pastoral touch, somewhat familiar to those we see in the book Livre de caricatures tant bonnes que mauvaises by Charles Germain de Saint-Aubin. In this book, she is one of the author's main targets. Note the jester at the bottom of the right, the page you see on the right. This is a fantastic, subversive work full of mischief and puzzles and a great source for cultural historians, including those of dress. The inscription on the portrait of the left, added later like the date, is baffling. Est-ce récompense ou punition? Is this reward or punishment? Dressed as a fore-shepherdess, perhaps as a theatrical costume, she has a crook in her right hand and wears an appropriate straw hat decorated with flowers. Does what appears to be a crosier in her left hand indicate some episcopal reference? The contemporary meanings of this image are lost to us. My next image is of Jacques Cazot, author of verse, novels, and fairy tales. It's one of my favorite speaking portraits, which sums up to me the particular French concept of esprit. Wit, vivacity, sensitivity, and intelligence are evident here, as well as the particular elegance of wearing formal dress with a relaxed air. Perronneau's loose handling of paint is seen in the way he depicts the three-piece suit of fine salmon pink Genoa velvet. Note the typical 18th century gesture of inserting a hand through the buttons of the waistcoat to show off the sleeve ruffle of Flemish lace, like that of the ruffle on his shirt front. Powdered wigs are often thought to give a sense of uniformity to faces and thus reduce the individuality of the wearer. But here, the boucle of Cazot's stylish wig à la mousquetaire seem to echo the slight curve of his smile. How alive he seems, but he was guillotined in 1792 for his counter-revolutionary opinions. The importance of appearances in the 18th century is demonstrated in many ways, which include a love of the theatrical, of disguise, and the masquerade, and there was a particular vogue for the historical in dress. Not the antique, because it was too serious, thus inimical to fantasy and playfulness, and too far from the reality of contemporary clothing. From the 1760s, artists had tried to encourage women to adopt what Sir Joshua Reynolds called an air of the antique in their dress, but the results were sometimes slightly absurd. Only at the end of the century did the classical influence women's dress. History of the more recent kind had greater appeal, notably that of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, far enough away in time to be romantic and yet close enough to be familiar. The clothing of this period was interpreted in a number of ways, from the elaborate and detailed to the more imaginative and poetic. In France, there was a vogue for Spanish dress of the period, Spain being relatively isolated in Europe and somewhat mysterious and regarded as still adhering to certain styles of its historic costume. Thus, it became often synonymous with generic historic fashion in the theatre and as fancy dress, and often linked to the French fashion of the same period. The next image is an example. This star of the high society and intimate of the court of Louis XV is depicted in a lustrous white satin dress with elaborate ruching on the sleeves, perhaps in imitation of the slashing of the upper fabric of the sleeves in fashion in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. The bodice too is decorated with smaller ruches, and the whole dress is festooned with fake pearls, although those round her neck may be her own, framed by a high Medici collar. It seems to me that this ensemble was probably made for this portrait, Rosling being famous for his skill in the depiction of fabrics. As for the more nuanced and imaginative interpretation of Spanish costume, we turn to Jean-Honoré Fragonard in his well-known Portrait de Fantaisie of the late 1760s, early 1770s. A bravura portrait, almost Rubens-like in rounded forms and glowing colors, in which Saint-Non is dressed in an imaginary doublet or tunic over which is draped a diagonal sash, a very Baroque touch. He wears brown breeches, high Cordovan leather boots in early 17th century style, with butterflies, which were butterfly-shaped leather patches which held the spurs in place, a soft white falling ruff, and a dark gray red hat with a feather. It is a lyrical and poetic portrait with a lightness of touch and intensity of feeling. Fragonard's genius in the Portrait de Fantaisie lay in turning history into poetry. The English equivalent of the Spanish was Van Dyck. In other words, the inspiration of Anthony van Dyck's portraits at the English court in the 1630s, a style of dress popular for portraiture and for masquerades. A considerable number of Van Dyck costumes still survive. Van Dyck's style encompasses dress in portraits, fancy dress, and that in masquerades. It was hugely popular. Even the royal family, King George and Queen Charlotte with their 6 eldest children, were all depicted in this costume in 1770, a portrait which the aesthetic Horace Walpole rightly labeled as ridiculous and bad. Not all images of English sitters look as inspired as Saint-Non. So in a sense, with Fragonard still in mind, I'm going to first turn from the sublime to the more prosaic with this portrait of Sir Roger Bradshaw and his wife Dorothy by Edward Hadley. In this wooden portrait, the couple are shown in reasonably correct clothing for the early 1630s. She is in pale blue silk, he is clothed in brown with a short red ermine-lined cloak, a reference perhaps to the noble status of many of Van Dyck's sitters. Both wear the correct laced edged collars and ruffs. While she retains her own hairstyles, Sir Roger's long bob with wig is a fair imitation of men's hair à la Van Dyck, and the artist has given him the correct shoes, decorated with shoe roses of the early 17th century. Did sitters think such portraits, evoking an admired past, conferred a kind of immortality to them? They must have done, as they are often to be found in the houses of the country gentry as well as in those of the nobility. Horace Walpole, man of letters and art historian, attending a masquerade in 1742, noted that there were quantities of Van Dycks which walked out their frames. Many portraits in what was called the Van Dyck taste, like the portrait we are looking at by a very minor artist, are fairly pedestrian. For the choice of artist was crucial, whether in fancy dress as here or the real costume, as in this a portrait of Thomas William Coke by Pompeo Batoni. The quality of the artist can be seen here in his depiction of a white doublet embroidered in silver with silk knee breeches and ermine-lined pink cloak worn over one shoulder in Van Dyck style and matching pink accessories, garters fastened below the knee, an ostrich feather in his white and silver hat, there's also a white feather, a rosette on his lace collar and on his shoes. The elegant and stylish costume suggests a man of taste and wealth, rich enough to afford a Batoni, who had a profitable business catering to young milordi on the Grand Tour. This is probably the costume he wore at a masquerade in Rome in 1773, held by Charlotte Stuart, later Duchess of Albany, the illegitimate daughter of the young pretender to the British throne, Charles Frederick Stuart. The pose is taken from Van Dyck's portrait of Robert Rich, 2nd Earl of Warwick, and Batoni conveys how the perceived glamour of the clothing of the reign of Charles I imbues this accomplished portrait. Great artists play games with dress to suit their own notions of what they see as ideal for their sitters. They may alter some of the details of the dress and sometimes remove what they consider to be too fussy or too fashionable. Picasso once claimed that the principle of true art is not to portray, but to evoke. And the costume of the past gave artists the opportunity to create romantic fantasies which incorporate the sense of contemporary dress along with an imaginative interpretation of historic styles. An example of what I mean can be found in this portrait of Frances Duncombe by Thomas Gainsborough. Loosely inspired by Rubens' portrait of his second wife, Helena Formont, of the early 1630s, now in the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon, this dress is imagined by Gainsborough, but clearly retains elements of the 1770s style. It comprises a blue silk gown with a train and bunched up at the sides, as in the Rubens portrait, a fashion also in vogue at the date of the portrait, and with sleeves open at the front seam, as in Van Dyck, and worn over a silvery white shirt. She carries a plumed hat like that Helena Formont wears and a raised Medici collar. Pearls abound not just on the dress, but the hat and the shoes. Somebody once asked me if this was a real dress and was disappointed when I said no, but it doesn't really matter because a portrait is a Ding an sich, an end in itself. Her appearance is a harmony between her fashionable face and headdress, the dress a persuasive and magical reinterpretation of the past created by Gainsborough. Both France and England in the 18th century were in love with Turquerie, the imitation of all things Turkish, which affected interior design, furniture, architecture, theatre, music, and dress. However fanciful and inaccurate these imitations were, for Turquerie wasn't serious but playful, it freed the imagination to discover new ways of seeing fashion and fantasy. The declining Ottoman Empire opened its doors to travelers, and these included artists who were fascinated by the costumes they saw. The most famous was the Swiss Jean-Étienne Lyotard, who spent many years there. He adopted Turkish clothing and was able to paint the versions of Ottoman Turkish dress worn in the Western European trading communities in Galata and Smyrna. The most beautiful of these, I think, is the portrait of his wife. It has the delicacy of pastel and the detail is astounding. Look at the small vase of flowers on the Persian carpet. Lyotard was an artist famed for the accuracy in which he depicted dress. On ne doit jamais peindre ce que l'on ne voit pas was his dictum, and it seems likely that this was one of the costumes he collected in Turkey and brought back to Europe. The way he approaches this portrait, the sitters flowered, embroidered entirely over a cream-colored smock, which gives us just a hint of the loose trousers worn beneath, the contemplative pose which she adopts results in an enchanting work of art. I now move from the beauty of reality to a completely different version of the dress à la turque. Copley, a New England artist with pro-English political views, could only learn about the vogue for Turquerie and the way it had influenced fashion in England from prints, images of Turkish costume, European versions in portraiture, and from masquerades illustrated in the newspapers. He must also have been aware of the growing vogue for informality in women's dress in England, information no doubt obtained from transatlantic travelers and from fashion plates. Margaret Gage was the American wife of the Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in America. Perhaps Copley suggests divided loyalties in her pose and the air of abstraction on her face. He depicts her in a quasi-oriental loose wrapping gown of coral silk, held in at the waist with a Turkish embroidered blue velvet belt. A gauzy silk turban is on her head, and enhancing the sense of slight melancholy in her appearance, her hair is unraveled at the back and falls over her shoulders. Rightly, the artist claimed that it was the best lady's portrait I ever drew, and I think it's his masterpiece. Is it a real dress or the invention of the artist? I don't think it's a dress owned by the sitter, but possibly a costume created in Copley's studio. Such a simple gown would be relatively easy to construct, and this has a liveliness missing in the artist's mundane and sometimes pretentious portraits of women in fanciful dress. I've mentioned the word masquerade a number of times, and an essential element of this popular pastime is, of course, disguise and role-playing. If fashion, as Mallarmé claims, is the goddess of appearances, so is playing games via clothing to create new identities and a heightened awareness of the senses. This is particularly so, perhaps, in France during the first half of the 18th century, a period of extravagant bal masqués at court and in high society. In preference to character costumes, many women chose to wear the elegant and capacious domino gown, which, when masqueraders and masked at night, revealed stylish, fashionable dress. The spotlight, like a scene in the theater, is on the central figure, a woman in the last stage of her preparations for the masquerade, having the final touches added to her powdered hair by her maid. Her white linen peignoir protects the superb silk dress she wears, a robe volante, a loose early form of the robe à la française, in peach and silver silk. In a few minutes, she will take off the peignoir and step into her domino, perhaps one similar in style to her seated friend on the left. On the right, a man in a dark blue domino holds a black mask with coral ribbons, perhaps an indication of a close link to the main actress in this performance, and two other masqueraders hold up their masks. The wavering light of the candles adds to the sense of intrigue. What adventures might take place at this masquerade? Some Acadian entertainments were held by the elite in private parks, which inspired Watteau to create a new kind of art, the fête galante. As Julie Anne Plax notes, under the guise of an artificial second self, those taking part in the fête galante enjoy the erotic pleasures and dangers of a fête indirectly filtered through an aestheticizing refinement and distancing, which could become a complex and self-deceiving game. Reality mingles with the fanciful, pleasure with melancholy in an enchanted landscape. Nothing is quite clear. The two main characters perform a stately minuet to music on the musette, a kind of bagpipe, played by Watteau on the far right in 17th century dress with a loose white collar. On the left is the Flemish artist Nicolas Vleugels in a kind of Oriental Eastern European costume, perhaps invented by his friend Watteau. His dancing partner, possibly the actress Christine Charlotte Desmar, is in a fashionable dress of white satin with a soft fluted ruff around her neck and a blue cloak. Other people perform games of courtly love, and in the background are commedia dell'arte characters, which include Esedín in his striped costume behind Desmar, and on the far right is possibly Scaramouche in black. Watteau had a collection of costumes, some historical, some commedia dell'arte. It's not clear if they were real clothes, theater costumes, or designed by the artist himself. In this painting, all the characters live in harmony in what the Goncourts call an entire world of poetry and fantasy, in which nonetheless is an echo of melancholy. Such images inspired Verlaine's collection of poetry in 1869, Fête Galante, notably in Clair de Lune, where in a paysage choisi appear, I quote, charmants masques et bergamasques, jouant de lutte et dansant, et quasi tristes sous leur déguisement fantasque. Alas, there is no English Watteau to depict such dreamlike scenes, although the famous pleasure gardens in 18th century London, notably Vauxhall Garden, were intended to provide a kind of romantic Arcadian escapism in the summer months. Tree-lined avenues, temples, statuary, fountains, supper boxes in the Chinese or Gothic taste, and music pavilions. The gardens were lit up at night for masquerades and were notorious for indecorous behavior, according to contemporary accounts and novels. One writer in 1751 stated that they appealed especially to women who loved mirth, frolic, and laughter. Canaletto depicted Vauxhall Gardens, but it's a rather pedestrian image, the sole fanciful touch being a Turkish dining tent with a blue and gold roof. The only English artist who might have conjured up a taste of wonder and imagination in a similar setting is Gainsborough, and not in a pleasure garden, but in the fashionable St. James's Park in London. Aptly described by Horace Walpole as all a flutter like a lady's fan, the dresses, most made from floating layers of silk, gauze, and muslin, seem to be in harmony with the movement of the trees' waving foliage. The wide gossamer dresses in the center of the scene are particularly suited to ideas of fantasy, perhaps as ephemeral as their short-lived fabrics. Of the images of actual masquerades, most are portraits of individuals who wished a visual record of an enchanted evening, especially if they had chosen a quote-unquote timeless historical costume. But there are a few paintings which depict the huge variety of costumes chosen for the masquerade, and many prints which reveal them in more detail, aided by accounts called Masquerade Intelligence in English newspapers. During the winter season, when the pleasure gardens were closed, grand indoor premises with elaborate and spectacular decor were needed. The most popular in the 1760s and early 1770s being Carlisle House in Soho, then a fashionable area of London. Cornelis, an adventuress of dubious reputation, born in Venice and with a theatrical background, held popular subscription masquerades. We are not transported here to a world of elegance and fancy, but a scene which offers what Mikhail Bakhtin, in his famous study of the carnivalesque, calls the violation of natural boundaries, mockeries and transgression. So among the wide range of characters depicted, I like the hurdy-gurdy player with a dancing bear, which is not a real bear, but a very hot man in a bear skin, a madman with a straw in his hair, and to the left of the harlequin in his traditional checkered costume, a monk and a nun, popular figures to mock in a Protestant country, in which it was widely believed that sexual relations between them were rife. On the far left is a man dressed as Death in a coffin costume. So upsetting did his fellow masqueraders find his appearance that he was forced to leave. Two popular characters from the Commedia dell'arte appear, the Harlequin prominent in the front, and at the back in the center, Punch, with his hooked nose and vast belly. Such figures provided amusement due to their acrobatics and ready wits. The Commedia dell'arte first appeared at the Carnival in Venice in the 16th century, but the various characters derive from different parts of Italy. Pulcinella, Punch, for example, is from Naples and is inspired a famous series of frescoes recording their adventures, for he becomes multiplied by Gian Domenico Tiepolo in the last years of the Venetian Republic, before this republic was ended by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797. Pulcinella is in a tall conical hat, white jacket and trousers, and he takes on all the roles of society. They eat and drink, get married, have children, and enjoy a vast range of entertainments such as dancing, riding on swings, and going to the circus. They become every man with all their pleasures and misfortunes, a comédie humaine, full of humor, fantasy, and delight. Here, Pulcinella falls in love with a female Pulcinella at the carnival. And now, to end with perhaps the finest art form in Venice, the masquerade. In this scene from the carnival, people from all classes, some in their working clothes, or are they impersonators of sailors, gondoliers, and tradesmen from exotic lands? They mingle with masqueraders, Venetians in black dominoes and foreigners in colored ones. You may have to take my word for it, as so much is going on here, but on the far right is a harlequin, and in the middle distance center, a Pulcinella in white. And of course, Venetian women in their customary black commingle with masqueraders, as we can see in this detail. Here are three figures: a Venetian woman on the left, wearing the zenda, a large black veil, often tied at the back of the waist, and worn with a black skirt. Then a woman in a fashionable French dress, wearing a man's wig. And on the right, a man in a blue domino lined with red, who wears the popular white mask called larva, and beneath it, for complete disguise, the lower part of his face is covered by a lace scarf called bauta. The Venetian carnival costume, the black domino, bauta, lace mantellina, and the three-cornered man's hat, in which the mask could be placed, was androgynous. In Pietro Longhi's famous painting of the exhibition of a rhino, her name was Clara, at the 1751 carnival, are the figures in the unisex white lava masks men or women? Women could also wear the black velvet moretta, but this was inconvenient as it had to be held in place by a knob held in the mouth. The woman at the back in green, for example, has removed hairs. Visitors often commented on a feeling of gloominess at so much black clothing, remarking that even the gondolas were black in Venice. The masquerade sent out ambivalent messages, not just joyful, but at the same time slightly sinister due to its pagan origins. These origins celebrated life while recognizing that death was always present. The carnival costume was worn on a number of occasions, such as visiting the Ridotto, the public gaming house, and on the many holidays which made up the life of the city. One English visitor noted in June 1771, "It is carnival in Venice almost all the year round, and visitors are obliged to go about everywhere in masquerade." An alternative to the voluminous domino was a black cloak, more revealing of the clothes below, but lighter and less restrictive to wear. See, for example, this man enjoying coffee who wears a black cloak under his lace mantellina and pauta. And the King of Sweden wore a longer cloak and a larva mask at a masquerade on the 16th March 1792 at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, where he was assassinated by a malcontented courtier. He is the subject, of course, of Verdi's opera Un ballo in maschera. The cloak is worn over a knitted silk doublet with the star of the Order of the Seraphim, and inspired by the early 17th century clothing of his famous ancestor Gustavus Adolphus, and pantaloons, tights of the same material, all designed by the king himself, who was passionate about dress, collected historic garments, and liked to perform in court theatricals, for which he often designed the costumes. There are many contemporary accounts of the carnival in Venice, along with paintings, all of which conjure up a memorable, fantastic, and often raucous entertainment. It was the perfect culmination of young aristocrats on the Grand Tour. Not surprising then that they wanted to keep a souvenir of their masquerade adventure, and pastel was the perfect medium to capture the details of what they wore, such as the glimpse of a fine embroidered waistcoat and the softness of the fur edging in this blue velvet gown. Lord Boyne was at the Carnival in Venice from January to March 1730, and again the following winter, so a wrap-over gown of this kind in lieu of a lighter domino would keep him warm as well as demonstrating his taste and wealth. Particularly enchanting is the spidery delicacy of the lace, which falls over his shoulders like fine long hair, creating a femininity which is in keeping with the ambivalent sexuality suggested by the masquerade costume. Moreover, this costume was flattering and added the note of elegant fantasy, which was such an appealing aspect of the masquerade. One of my favorite portraits is therefore another pastel. The vivid blue of the dress worn by Madame Bouer, the wife of a Swiss merchant based in Amsterdam, sets off the beautiful harmony created by the black and white of the masquerade ensemble. White larva placed on top of the black hat perched rakishly over her left eye, white powdered hair and very pale face. Black pauta, mantellina, probably of fine silk bobbin lace known as blonde, and a shining white satin domino with curving edges of ruched silk, pinked to give decorative small spikes. As with the portrait by the same artist of Maria Farg in Turkish dress that we saw earlier, the intense reality of the depiction of clothing has become magical. Both paintings by Lyotard, they are two of the most enchanting images of women in the 18th century. My final image is this masquerade scene by Louis-Joseph Le Lorrain. Or perhaps the better title would be A Fantasy of the Masquerade, as it is completely in the spirit of fantasy, theatre and imagination. In my book on dress in 18th century Europe of 2002, I speculated that this might be the entertainment held by the Russian court in St. Petersburg. It has the first and the extravagant finery of Russian court festivities. Le Lorrain traveled there in 1758 to be the director of Empress Catherine's Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, but died of pneumonia the following year. But I also wondered if this could be a fantasy on the theme of the Bal Masqué. And this is what I think now of this extraordinary painting full of mystery and anticipation. Le Lorrain was an architect, engraver, and painter, although portraiture didn't figure prominently in his oeuvre. But he was also a designer of interior decor and furniture and of theatrical sets. And when one looks especially at the central seated figure, we are looking at a dress totally inspired by the theater. See the glittering costume jewelry with streams down on the robings on the left side of a white dress, and which are caught up somewhat unconvincingly in the ermine on the right. Similar fake jewelry is draped over the front of her bodice, around her neck, and in her fur cap. If the dress were to follow the usual arrangement, the bodice of the dress should be white and join on to the wide open gown. As it is, the bodice is coral colored to match the equally embellished satin underskirt. Quite what part the small four-trimmed coral hip panier, I can't think of another word, play in this ensemble, one can't say. Nor does it matter, for the costume is a glorious mishmash completely invented by Le Lorrain. Equally theatrical and fanciful are the costumes worn by the two young men. Both have fur-trimmed caps with feathers and tunics to mid-thigh with sketchy hussar braids on the chest. The dress of the youth on the left is more visible, dyed red pantaloons à la hussar with gold braid down the front and a rather stylish short boots with tassels. These two figures seem to be inspired by the dress of Hungarian hussars, a popular masquerade costume, but they also suggest a general Central European influence, a startling contrast to the male fashions in Western Europe, and which prompt a question we can't answer. Who are these people? What is their relationship to each other? And what will happen next? This is the most wonderful and imaginative image of the masquerade that I know. If I glamorize the subject of my talk too much, it's because I see it as a crucial aspect of the 18th century culture. Dressing up in life and in art, artifice, playfulness, and heightened sense of pleasure seem to me to typify a key element of the Ancien Régime. We look back at this period beyond the almost insuperable barrier of the French Revolution and know that it had to vanish. Thank you very much.